Ever notice how we just throw around the word intelligence? Like everybody's on the same page. He's a business genius, or she's a design whiz, or they aced that exam. I gotta be brilliant, right?
Yeah.
But when we actually stop and think about it, what are we really saying? What's the science behind these gut feelings? Today we're taking a deep dive into intelligence, and let me tell you, these research papers you gave me had some surprises.
Yeah, it's a wild ride for sure.
We're talking history, we're talking how in the world you measure something as slippery as intelligence, and most importantly, what those measurements can and can't tell us. Ready to unpack all this.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
The first thing that kind of blew my mind was discovering where intelligence research even began. I was not prepared for that.
Oh, yeah. It's a pretty interesting story. I mean, how would you even start quantifying something as complex as intelligence? Especially back then, the tools they had were, well, limited. It's like trying to, I don't know, measure how much awe is in a stunning sunset.
Right. You feel it, but good luck putting that under a microscope.
Huh. Exactly. But hey, they had to start somewhere, right? So in the late 1800s, you've got Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, and he's convinced that intelligence boils down to how sharp your senses are.
Wait, are you saying that back then, if you had a super refined palate for, let's say, wine, you were considered a genius?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go dusting off those wine tasting notes just yet. Obviously, Galton's theory didn't exactly stand the test of time, but you got to give him credit for at least trying something new. He really pushed the boundaries with things like reaction time tests and even, get this, the ability to tell the difference between different weights.
Okay, so maybe a tad simplistic in hindsight, but hey, every field has its humble beginnings, right? Thank goodness intelligence testing moved on from the taste test phase. And that's where things start to sound a little more familiar, at least to us today, right? Enter the IQ test.
Exactly. And this is where Alfred Binet comes in. He was a French psychologist who really revolutionized the field. His task was to figure out a way to identify students who needed extra help in school, and he had two core beliefs that ended up shaping everything that came after. First, he believed that intelligence actually develops as we grow older. And second, that our capacity to think and learn, that it remains pretty stable over time. Those two ideas, they became the bedrock of the very first intelligence tests.
Okay, so that's where we get the idea of mental age, right? Like, you take a test and your score is compared against the average score of other people in your age group.
Exactly. And that leads us to the intelligence quotient, or IQ, which, as we know, people love to debate. Originally, it was a pretty simple calculation. Divide someone's mental age by their actual age and multiply that number by 100. So if you're 10 years old and you score the same as the average 10-year-old, you'd have an IQ of 100, smack dab in the middle.
But isn't there another kind of IQ score, one that compares you to everyone else, not just your own age group?
That's deviation IQ. It's all based on the bell curve. Instead of just comparing you to your peers, deviation IQ figures out where you land on the curve of intelligence for everyone. 100 is still average, but now it factors in how common or rare your score is compared to the whole population.
Ah, okay, so it's like the difference between, say, winning your school spelling bee versus winning the Scripps National Spelling Bee, right? Suddenly the competition's a lot tougher.
Ah, perfect analogy. Which leads us to, I think, the biggest question of all. Is intelligence just one single thing, like this overall smartness we either have or we don't? Or is it more like a bunch of different skills and abilities all working together?
Now that's the million-dollar question. I have a feeling it's more complicated than a simple yes or no. You're telling me it's got to be more than just like one magic ingredient, right? So how do researchers even begin to untangle all this? What's the starting point?
Well, there are two major approaches. First, you've got the psychometric approach, and this one is all about taking those abstract ideas about intelligence and, well, turning them into numbers. That's where your IQ tests come into play.
Trying to put a number on this big, complex thing.
Right. But then you've got the cognitive approach,
Yeah.
which goes deeper into how our brains actually work to make us intelligent.
Yeah.
Learning, problem solving, processing information, that's their focus.
So one's the measurement and the other is the how behind it. Makes me think about something I vaguely recall from like Psych 101 factor analysis. Does that ring a bell here?
Ah, yes. Factor analysis. That's a statistical method for finding patterns hidden in data. With intelligence, it's used to look at all those IQ test results and figure out if certain skills, tend to group together.
So like if you kill it at vocabulary quizzes A and D, you can write a killer poem. That suggests maybe those two things are connected to some underlying factor.
Exactly. It's how researchers started realizing that intelligence isn't just this single thing, but a bunch of different abilities working together.
Which brings us to the Cattell-Horn model, which really caught my eye, with its two main components, crystallized and fluid intelligence. I feel like a lot of listeners are probably with me on this. Refresh our memory on those two.
Okay, picture this. Intelligence is a two-layer cake. Crystallized intelligence is the bottom, rich and dense layer. All the knowledge you've built up over time, your skills. It's what makes you a trivia whiz or lets you navigate a new city with ease. Remember everything you learned. That's crystallized intelligence at work.
Our mental library card catalog, but it keeps expanding, right?
Right, and then there's fluid intelligence. That's your top layer, light and adaptable. This is your ability to think on your feet, solve problems you've never seen before, roll with the punches.
So like if I'm trying to solve a tricky puzzle or if I pick up a new skill quickly, even if it's outside my comfort zone.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Fluid intelligence tends to peak in our early adulthood and then slowly declines. But crystallized intelligence, that can actually stay strong or even get stronger throughout life.
Okay, so even if I'm not picking up like Mandarin Chinese as fast as I did in my 20s, everything I've learned is still there to support me.
Precisely. It shows how powerful lifelong learning can be. We're constantly adding to that crystallized intelligence. It's a pretty valuable asset to have.
So I'm curious now, is there a connection between these types of intelligence, crystallized and fluid, and things like working memory or even short-term memory? Are they all linked?
Now, that's a question that researchers are still trying to fully figure out. It's complicated. Some studies show a pretty strong connection between fluid intelligence and working memory. That's your ability to hold info in mind and use it on the fly. But other studies suggest the link is closer to short-term memory, which is more about just holding on to info for a short burst. It's tricky. Like many things in science, more research is needed to fully grasp how all these cognitive processes work together.
Every answer seems to lead to even more questions. It's amazing. Speaking of different ways to look at intelligence, we can't forget John Carroll's three-stratum theory. This one always makes my brain do a loop-de-loop.
It's definitely more complex, but we can break it down. Imagine a pyramid. At the very bottom, layer I, you've got all these specific abilities, memory span, how quickly your brain processes images, your vocabulary, all those individual skills.
Like the individual building blocks of intelligence before they're assembled.
Yes. Then, in layer 2, things start to combine. This layer is where you get broader abilities, formed from those individual skills we talked about in layer 1. Things like fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence, your ability to perceive visually those bigger concepts.
So like taking those individual Lego blocks from layer I and making something bigger and more meaningful with them in layer 2.
Perfect way to put it. And at the very top of the pyramid, layer 3, sits the G factor, which represents general intelligence, the big boss, influencing everything else.
So G is like the conductor of an orchestra, bringing all the instruments together into a symphony of thought.
Love that analogy. But it's important to remember, not everyone in the field agrees on the G factor. It's a big topic of debate.
Every model adds another layer of intrigue to all this, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Now, there's Robert Sternberg, who argued that those classic IQ tests, they weren't showing the whole picture of how we actually use intelligence out in the real world, which is messy and unpredictable.
Right. Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence really zeroed in on that practical, real-world application of smarts.
Which makes a ton of sense. Acing a math test in a quiet classroom is totally different from navigating a tricky social situation, right?
100%. That's where his 3 sub-theories come in. First, there's meta components. Your brain's executive team, planning, monitoring, evaluating what you're doing. They call the shots.
So, like, if I'm plotting out my next chess move or strategizing a big presentation, meta components are running the show.
You got it. Next are the performance components. The workers. They actually carry out the tasks, processing info, digging up memories. They get things done.
So if I'm trying to remember some obscure fact during trivia or like speed reading through an article.
Exactly. Those are your performance components hard at work. And last but not least, you've got knowledge acquisition components. Their whole job is, well, gaining new knowledge, learning, connecting new info to what you already know.
So if I pick up languages quickly or I'm good at grasping new information, that's a sign of strong knowledge acquisition components.
Bingo. They're all about expanding that mental toolbox of yours.
Makes you realize there are so many ways to be intelligent. And that reminds me of another big name, Howard Gardner, and his theory of multiple intelligences.
Right. Wasn't he the one who said, forget this whole single IQ score thing? Gardner really threw a wrench in the traditional view. You're right. He was adamant that those standard IQ tests, they were way too focused on a narrow slice of abilities. He said we have multiple intelligences, all separate, all valuable.
It's like that saying, it's not how smart you are, it's how you're smart. Some people shine in music, others in, like, 3D thinking, others connecting with people.
Exactly. He blew the whole thing wide open, recognizing that people excel in all sorts of ways that those old IQ tests weren't even touching. And that kind of leads us to another biggie that often gets overlooked. Emotional intelligence, or EQ. Can't escape that term these days.
Seriously, it's everywhere you look, but what's at the heart of it? What does it actually mean to have high EQ?
It boils down to understanding and managing not just your own emotions, but also recognizing and responding to other people's emotions. Self-awareness is key, empathy, and being able to navigate all those, let's face it, sometimes really messy social situations we find ourselves in.
So you're not just aware of what you're feeling, but you get how others are feeling too. Makes sense.
Right. Researchers Mayer and Slovey, they broke emotional intelligence down into 4 main areas. First, you've got perceiving emotions, which is all about accurately picking up on emotions, both your own and others. Then there's using emotions in thought. How do emotions actually play into our thinking and the choices we make?
So it's not about ignoring emotions, it's about understanding their role in how we think.
Interesting. Exactly. Then there's understanding emotions that delves into how emotions can change, how they play off each other, all that complexity. And finally, there's managing emotions, which is all about, well, managing your own feelings effectively. And even, get this, being able to influence how other people are feeling in a positive way, of course.
Makes you think, if we started valuing EQ as much as we do IQ, who knows what kind of positive changes we'd see in the world?
Couldn't agree more. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about something that's been puzzling researchers for a while, the Flynn effect. Heard of it?
Vaguely. It has to do with IQ scores changing over time, if I'm remembering right.
You got it. The Flynn effect basically says that, on average, IQ scores have been going up around the world, generation after generation. Kind of a head-scratcher when you think about it.
It really is. Like, are we all collectively getting smarter? What could explain that kind of consistent increase over time?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Researchers have a few theories. One idea is that it's all about better nutrition and healthcare. Makes sense. A healthier population, you're going to have better brain development overall.
Right. Got to feed those brains. So like any other part of our body need the right fuel to function right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Another theory is that it's the world itself that's gotten more complex. Think about all the technology, the non-stop information. Our brains are working harder, adapting to new stuff all the time. Could be leading to more cognitive flexibility, better problem solving.
So like our brains, our muscles, get stronger the more we challenge them.
Love that. And then, of course, there's the idea that better education and easier access to information, that's got to play a role too. Early childhood education is huge, and with the internet, we've got more knowledge at our fingertips than ever before.
It's wild to think about how different things are now. But wait, didn't I read somewhere that the Flynn effect is plateauing or even reversing in some places?
Yeah, it is.
Hmm?
Researchers trying to figure out why. Could be all sorts of reasons. But it goes to show how dynamic this whole thing is. Intelligence is shaped by a million factors. Genes and environment constantly interacting.
The nature versus nurture debate, is it our genes or our upbringing that makes us intelligent?
A question for the ages.
Mm.
And like most things, it's not so black and white. It's both. It's like this intricate dance between your DNA and your experiences.
So our genes are like the starting point, but our environment, that's what shapes how the whole thing plays out.
Beautifully put.
Mm.
Twin studies have given us some clues, though. They looked at identical twins raised separately in genes. They play a big role, accounting for like 50–80% of the differences in IQ. But that means 20–50% is still down to environment. How you're raised, education, what you experience, it's huge.
Makes you think about all that untapped potential we all have, just waiting for the right circumstances to really bloom.
Absolutely. And it underscores just how vital it is that we create supportive environments for kids, especially those who might not have the same advantages.
Can't just ignore that. Now, before we wrap this deep dive up, we got to touch on gender differences in intelligence, even if it's a bit of a minefield.
You got to be really careful here and always go back to the science. While research is clear that there's zero difference in general intelligence between men and women, there are studies showing some differences when it comes to specific abilities.
So it's not that one's smarter than the other, more like there are different cognitive strengths that each tend to have, on average, right?
Nailed it. For example, men, they tend to do a bit better on average at those spatial reasoning tasks, like mentally flipping objects around in their head, navigating spaces.
Ah, so they'd crush it at those escape room puzzles we talked about.
Huh, exactly. Women, on the other hand, they often excel in verbal fluency, remembering details, and picking up on those emotional cues.
So they'd be the ones acing trivia night, remembering everything from a meeting, knowing exactly how their friend's feeling.
Pretty much. It's fascinating how these differences can actually play out in everyday life.
Mm.
But, huge caveat, these are just averages. There's tons of overlap between individuals. Never make assumptions about someone based solely on their gender.
Absolutely. And that makes me think about stereotype threat, how those assumptions can actually impact how well people perform, right?
It's a real thing. Stereotype threat is when someone knows there's a negative stereotype about their group, and it creates this anxiety, self-doubt that can actually make them do worse. Like if a woman keeps hearing women are bad at math, even if she's a math whiz, she might get anxious during a test, and that anxiety can mess with her performance.
It's like that stereotype becomes a hurdle, even if it's not true at all.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial to challenge those stereotypes, create spaces where everyone feels supported and empowered. Our potential is way bigger than any stereotype.
Well said. This deep dive into intelligence has been amazing. From those first attempts at measuring intelligence to all the new research on multiple intelligences, EQ, nature versus nurture, it's mind-blowing.
We've only scratched the surface. Intelligence is such a complex and constantly changing field. There's always something new to uncover.
And on that note, here's a final thought for our listeners. We're living in a world where artificial intelligence is advancing at an insane speed. What does that mean for how we define intelligence in the future? If machines can outperform us in so many ways, what does it even mean to be intelligent? Something to think about.
Now, that's a question that'll keep researchers and philosophers busy for a long time to come.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring intelligence with us. Remember, keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep those brilliant brains of yours engaged. Until next time.